Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're diving into one of the most baffling, whiplash-inducing two-day sequences in modern biotech history. Imagine checking your portfolio thinking, hey, I can finally retire, and then waking up the very next morning to realize a massive chunk of that value literally vanished into thin air. Well, that's exactly what happened to Moderna. We're going to explore how a massive, undeniable medical breakthrough led directly to a stunning market crash.
Let's put this into perspective. On August 19th, 2026, Moderna's stock absolutely exploded. It shot up nearly 177% in a single trading session. To give you an idea of scale, that meant the company added an astronomical $30 billion in market value in just a matter of hours. The market was essentially throwing a massive ticker tape parade for a monumental scientific victory. But here's where the story takes a really wild turn. The very next morning, the market opened, and investors experienced some serious whiplash. That euphoric high violently collapsed. The stock plunged 23.5% by the end of the day on August 20th. Billions of dollars were wiped out just as quickly as they'd been created. So this violent swing leaves us staring at a massive mystery. If a stock drops that much, that fast, you've got to ask yourself, did the underlying cancer vaccine breakthrough suddenly fail overnight? Did the researchers uncover a massive flaw in the data while everyone was sleeping?
Well, the answer to that is a resounding no. The science didn't disappear at all. In fact, it's incredibly robust. It all started with a catalyst known as V940, or mRNA 4157. This is a radical new personalized mRNA cancer therapy being co-developed by Moderna and Merck. And the concept here is completely different from a standard vaccine you might just go get at your local pharmacy.
This is truly science fiction turned reality. The process works in 5 fascinating steps. First, doctors analyze a specific patient's tumor. Second, they identify the unique mutations that are creating abnormal proteins. Third, they create a highly personalized vaccine tailored exactly to that one specific patient. Fourth, they inject it to activate the patient's immune system. And finally, the newly trained immune system goes on the hunt to attack any residual cancer cells left behind after surgery. It's targeted, it's personal, and it's absolutely revolutionary.
And that initial massive 177% stock jump, that was triggered because the therapy actually worked in a pivotal setting. The companies announced that their phase 3 trial successfully met its targets in patients with stage 2B to 4 melanoma. Specifically, it hit its primary endpoint for keeping patients recurrence-free, meaning the cancer doesn't come back, and its key secondary endpoint for keeping them metastasis-free, meaning it doesn't spread to other organs. As we know, in the biotech world, a successful phase 3 trial is the gold standard needed for regulatory approval.
To really understand the hype here, we have to look back at their earlier phase 2B data. When this personalized vaccine was combined with Merck's cancer drug Keytruda, it showed some massive results. A 49% reduction in the risk of recurrence or death, and a 59% reduction in the risk of distant metastasis or death, compared to using just Keytruda alone. So when the phase 3 success was announced, investors saw these old numbers and immediately assumed the new data would be just as groundbreaking. Investors went absolutely crazy because this proved something fundamental about Moderna's future. For years, the market viewed them strictly as a quote-unquote COVID vaccine company. And with COVID revenues declining, that was a pretty dangerous label to have. But this cancer breakthrough, it proved Moderna could officially shift its identity to a multi-product mRNA platform company. It meant the technology wasn't just a one-hit wonder. It could actually be applied to oncology and beyond, theoretically securing their long-term revenue. This realization sent shockwaves through the entire market. This wasn't just a Moderna story anymore. It lifted other major mRNA players, with BioNTech jumping around 20% and Novavax gaining roughly 6%. It even pushed the entire broad NASDAQ Biotechnology Index up 4.4% in a single day. Investors were aggressively repricing the possibility that mRNA technology could become vastly bigger than just the pandemic. Which brings us to a massive central paradox. We've established the science was groundbreaking, right? The phase 3 trial was a success. The mRNA platform was totally validated. So, if the clinical news remained positive and the science didn't change at all, why on earth did we see a 23.5% crash the very next day? What broke?
While the first culprit is the actual data that was released, or, rather, the data that wasn't released, Moderna only put out top-line results. In the biotech world, this is just the initial high-level summary. It tells you if the trial met its statistical endpoint, basically a simple yes or no. But it doesn't give you the granular, detailed data set. That full data won't actually be available until a future medical meeting.
Because we lacked that full data, Investors woke up on day 2 staring at this massive wall of unanswered questions. Yes, the trial succeeded, but what was the exact magnitude of the benefit? How long does that benefit actually last? Are there new safety concerns? And how on earth do you manufacture a bespoke vaccine for thousands of people? What's the price tag going to be? It's kind of like trying to buy a house without knowing the price or when it'll be built. Without answers to these questions, assigning a firm dollar value to the company became incredibly difficult for investors.
The second culprit behind all this extreme volatility actually had nothing to do with science and everything to do with market mechanics. Right before the announcement, Moderna had a massive 13.5% short interest on its available trading shares, also known as the free float. This means a huge number of investors were actively betting that Moderna's stock price was going to fall. They were heavily shorting the stock. And this created a vicious feedback loop, triggering a classic short squeeze. Think about it. The good news comes out, the stock jumps, and suddenly all those short sellers are losing an absolute fortune. To stop their losses, they're forced to buy the stock to cover their positions. This forced buying pushes the price up even higher, which triggers even more short sellers to buy, pushing it higher again. So a huge chunk of that 177% jump was just short sellers panicking, not necessarily long-term investors buying into the science.
When you combine a chaotic short squeeze with sky-high expectations, you get a $30 billion surge that immediately forces the market to sober up. On day 2, investors looked at that staggering $30 billion of newly created value and had to critically reevaluate. They had to ask themselves, did we overshoot reality here? Is the promise of a cancer vaccine, which, by the way, isn't even approved yet, truly worth an instant $30 billion today? And part of that sober reality kicking in on day 2 is the logistical nightmare of manufacturing. Creating a personalized vaccine tailored to these specific genetic characteristics of every single patient's tumor is a vastly more complex commercial challenge than just pumping out millions of identical, standard COVID shots in massive vats. It requires an entirely new, highly specialized, and astronomically expensive supply chain.
Which brings us to the fundamental lesson of this entire explainer. We are looking at a stark contrast between two very different worlds. Science simply asks, does the treatment work? And the answer on August 19th was a joyful yes. But investing is much more ruthless. Investing demands to know, how much is that success currently worth in future cash flow? A great medical breakthrough does not guarantee a permanently high stock price if the expectations are completely disconnected from current commercial reality. As we wrap up this explainer, I'll leave you with this final, provocative thought to consider. The cancer breakthrough seems incredibly real, and it could genuinely change the world of oncology. But when that full, detailed dataset finally arrives at a future medical meeting, will the numbers actually justify the dawn of a new, highly valued Moderna era? Or was this 2-day roller coaster the ultimate example of biotech expectations getting dangerously far ahead of the evidence? I guess we'll just have to wait for the data to find out.